everyone, and happy Frozen New Year. We're here this evening with historian Lance Blyth and his new book, Ski, Climb, Fight, the 10th Mountain Division and the Rise of Mountain Warfare. In the fall of 1944, General Lucien Truscott, commander of the 5th Army, assigned the center offensive against the Germans, the effort in the highest elevations, to the 10th Mountain Division, elite American troops specially trained in mountain climbing, skiing, and survival in cold weather. 5 years earlier, the president of the National Ski Patrol had written a letter to Franklin Roosevelt proposing that the Army train special units for fighting in a mountain terrain, citing the effectiveness of the ski troop in Finland's heroic defense against the Soviets earlier that year. In a country where there are 2 million skiers, equipped, intelligent, and able, wrote Charles Minot Dole, not related to Bob Dole, I contend that it's more than reasonable to make soldiers out of skiers than it is to make skiers out of soldiers. These men were, many of them local, not only turned the tide of the war, but when they returned home, the 10th Army Division alumni founded more than 60 ski resorts in the U.S. The chat is open and you can use the Q&A for author questions. Also, the event is closed captioned and you can enable the captioning on your Zoom screen down below at the bottom. Lance Blyth is the command historian of the North American Aerospace Defense Command and the U.S. Northern Command. Blyth's new book, Ski, Climb, Fight, the 10th Mountain Division and Rise of Mountain Warfare, looks at how the 10th Mountain Division of World War II met the challenge of fighting in the mountains, where the armies must overcome the challenge via survival strategies and mobility, and how the U.S. Army does so today. He is also the author of the book Chiricahua and Janos, which received the Weber Clements Book Prize, examines centuries of violence in northern Mexico between the Chiricahua Apaches and the Hispanic garrison community of Janos. Please welcome Lance Blyth.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate being here, and thank you everyone for joining in this evening for you, afternoon for me here in Colorado. So what I thought I would do is start off with how I came to basically write this book. And the oops, there we go. Sorry about that. It goes back to about 6 years ago. I want to think this weekend. I was on a ski tour with some friends up on Chicago Ridge. It was a brutally cold day, a very bad avalanche condition day, and we decided to go someplace west facing and low angle to avoid that. And we ended up on this piece of ridge high up on the Continental Divide outside Ski Cooper. And if you look down over our left shoulders, you will see where Camp Hale was. As I made a switch after my wife took this picture, I could see the camp and I began to wonder, how did they do it? What did they do? And that started me off reading and researching. And then as a historian, it is something of an occupational hazard. I got pulled into something I didn't know because I wanted to learn more. Now, I started with trying to understand the 10th Mountain Division of World War II, which has quite a lot written about it, understandably so. But what I ended up with was trying to understand this larger issue of mountain warfare. And I needed to figure out what the heck I meant when I said mountain warfare. So I kicked around and looked at a lot of stuff and read stuff. Again, historian, that's kind of how we end up. And I finally ended up reading, once again, Karl von Clausewitz's On War, Vom Krieg, where early 19th century, he writes up kind of the latest about warfare at the time. And he does talk about mountains. And he said, look, mountains introduce a restraining or retarding element into military operations. He used the German word Aufhaltungen, I believe is how it's probably not said. But but it basically that kind of limiting, of pulling back on it. And that got me thinking, how do mountains do this? Well, we can look at mountains and say, well, they're sloped, they're relief. Mountains are steep by their very definition. There's at least 1,000 foot by one definition between its lowest and highest point for anything to be considered a mountain range. Elevation, mountains are generally higher than their surrounding terrain, again, by definition. And as you go up high enough, get over 5,000 feet or so, you start to run into problems with the altitude, with the lack of oxygen in the air. And finally, climate. Mountains are generally wetter and colder than their surrounding climates. As you climb up elevation, you lose temperature. Temperature drops. And so mountains for military operations are places where, one, everything takes longer because everything is harder to do, and you can die of exposure in the middle of summer. So those three things are the primary issues there. So to overcome this, military forces have to figure out how to survive in the mountains, how to be mobile in the mountains in order to maneuver on any enemy force in the mountains. And the unique thing about mountain warfare, about the only form I am aware of, is that the basic techniques and technologies for survival and mobility in the mountains are those found in the civilian skiing and mountaineering communities. And so repeatedly, armed forces have to go back to those communities to adapt techniques and technologies. This is not a surprise, I discovered, because mountain warfare, really the concept of it really comes around the mid-19th century and seems to accompany a rise in mountaineering in Europe. Top right-hand corner, there's a picture of Whymper up on the first ascent of the Matterhorn. Some of you know the story. Down on the other side, there was an Italian party trying to climb, which he proceeded to throw rocks at, in theory to get their attention. Who's to say? But part of that party was an Italian mountaineer by the name of Senna. Senna would later help create the Italian Alpine Club and would be in government in the 1870s when the Italian army decided that it needed to create some mountain troops to hold the Alps, to buy time for the rest of the army to mobilize. And by 1888, the French got in the game. In 1906, so did the Austrians. And you can see that bottom picture. There's some pictures of these folks all about 1907, 1908, drawn by an American officer who had from the New York National Guard, who had gone over to observe their summer exercises. So, as we say, the story that we often tell about the 10th Mountain Division of World War II was that Minot Dole brought the idea forward. This isn't quite accurately. The Army knew about mountain warfare. Here you have Field Manual 100-5 from 1939, the opening paragraph. This would basically stay in every version until the early 1960s. There is still a operations field manual today. The idea that you can do military operations if the troops are properly equipped, clothed, and inured by previous training. But what the Army didn't know about was that what was the equipment, what was the clothing, what was the training. That they did not understand, that they were not sure of. And so when Minot Dole exploits his Yale connections to get a meeting ultimately with General Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, who had signed out this manual a year prior, he brought a welcome set of technological experience and techniques to the Army. They had someone they could ask. The Army had decided in August of 1940 they were going to establish ski patrols, and the offer of the National Ski Patrol Systems. That's the lower left picture there. I like the picture is good. It's from the ski museum. Thanks to them, they shows a patroller with the red jackets don't come till after the war. He's got the diamonds, the double cross diamonds, and I enjoy the picture of the skier just biffing it in the lower part of the slope there. It's the more things change, the more they stay the same. But it's important to note, and I will plug my friend Christian Beckwith's 90-pound rucksack podcast. If you've not listened to it, just put 90, spell out the word 90-pound rucksack, and you will find christianbeckwith.com. himself a very accomplished alpinist. He wouldn't say that, but I will. Has that the American Alpine Club also played a large role in this. Besides the skiers, the National Ski Association. In the summer of 1939, a pair of American alpinists, Bob Bates and Adams Ad Carter, both scions of good New England families, I want to say Philadelphia area, were in Switzerland climbing, and they noticed the Swiss mountain troops mobilizing as the war was starting to break out. And they asked themselves the question, could we do that in the United States? How would we get the army to help do this? It takes a while, but by the summer of 1940, again, only about the same time that Minot Dole went and talked to General Marshall, the American Alpine Club reached out to the Secretary of War, which wasn't a big problem because Secretary Stimson had once been a member of the club in his earlier days and would later be brought back as an honorary member. So exploiting those connections, they took, the Army agreed to send a general officer to a meeting in New York where Bob Bates, who had been a member of the 1939 K2 expedition, along with several other of American mountaineers, Paul Petzel being the lone Westerner. There was some concern if this Wyoming cowboy was going to fit in with all these Ivy League educated individuals. He didn't, but that's another story. Had gone on to K2, climbed as high as any Americans had. They had to turn around and did that. But Bob Bates laid out all the equipment they took on K2 for this general officer. And he showed him in December of 1940 all the layers of clothing, the different types of socks, the boots, the parkas, the pants, the sleeping bags, the tents, the ropes, the ice axes, the pitons, the carabiners, all this equipment that was required. And impressed upon this general officer two things, it appears. One, that none of this equipment was made in the US. None of it had been produced. They had purchased it all from overseas vendors. The second thing they had to impress upon this general officer was the level of training it took to use it, the amount of time and the location it took to train. Because we know in December of 1940 is the first time, about a week after this meeting, two things happened. One, the War Department sends a letter to the American Alpine Club and says, could you tell us what equipment we would need? And the War Department, the American Alpine Club, got back to the American War Department with a "it depends" response. Where are you going? What elevation? What kind of mountains? And provided a very detailed list of equipment that would be necessary. They also, at this time, the director of operations, the chief of staff for operations, by the guy by the name of Harry Twaddle, wrote to General Marshall and said, we need to find a mountain camp. We need to build a place in the mountains where they can train for this. But it's 1940. The war is on. The U.S. is not in it. And so they do not pursue that. But as early as 1940, after Dole, after the National Ski Association, National American Alpine Club get to the War Department, they start many of these things in process. One of the things that they do is they send two lieutenant colonels to a meeting of the National Ski Association. And those colonels go there and say, okay, what kind of skis should we use? Now, I will suspect much of this audience is skiers. And you know, if you ask three skiers a question about skiing equipment, you're going to get five opinions. And that's definitely what they came into, much to their amusement. So the National Ski Association appointed a committee led by a guy by the name of Bester Robinson, who was a climber. He was a member of the rock climbing section of the Sierra Club out in California, but he was also a member of the National Ski Association, the American Alpine Club. And he takes an expedition in the spring of 1941 into the Bishop backcountry of California with a piece of equipment from every provider. Montgomery Ward, Eddie Bauer, you name it. They took it all in and they tested it. And they come back out, and in June of 1941, they write up all the specifications for all the gear should look like for skiing. They hadn't got to the American Alpine Club yet. Robinson would later go join those guys, and they would work that out really by the end of 1941. They also start this year, both the American Alpine Club and the Sierra and the National Ski Association begin to take their experiences and write them into handbooks. And in 1942, this manual ski mountaineering was published. Young David Brower was the editor of University of California Press at that time. He edited this. And then Ken Henderson of the American Alpine Club wrote together the Handbook of American Mountaineering. These are the first two handbooks written in the United States for any of this material. Previously, they had used European versions, French and German in particular. So these two handbooks, again published in 1942, these really are the beginning of U.S. Army's mountain warfare doctrine down to this day. By the end of 1941, after discussions and again support from Minot Dole and the American Alpine Club, the Army decides to activate a test force, a first battalion, one battalion, about 750, 800 guys at Fort Lewis to basically test how you would raise and train mountain units. And they're thinking of this time as mountain units. They never, ever really called them ski troops. And so this unit forms, and within a week or so of it forming, the war breaks out. World War II begins. And so General Marshall said before December 7th, 1941, the United States Army had lots of time and little money. After December 7th, 1941, they had lots of money, but little time to prepare units, and that would impact what would become 10th Mountain Division. So to get recruits for this, the Army needs to find people that can, that have some of the basic aptitude. Minot Dole's point was clear, that if people kind of knew the basics of this outdoor rec, it would be easier for them. He unquestionably exaggerated the numbers of skiers who were available. To be honest, the skill set this requires is really that of today of a backcountry skier, and there's only and that's a small portion of people who go to ski resorts. So even then, you had a very similar situation. But the Army contracts with the National Ski Patrol to basically be a clearinghouse for volunteers for the mountain troops. Something has never been done before, hasn't been done since. This is initially they did the famous 3 letters. You had to have 3 letters of recommendation. This went away pretty quickly, and they did enlist a number of people in 1941. They would enlist more in the summer of 1942, and then at the end of 1942 into the spring of 1944, they would continue to take volunteer applications and route them to the Army. Ultimately, they would send, and I think I've seen numbers, really, they received 12,000 applications in this time. The National Ski Patrol sent 10,000 of those applications onwards. Ultimately, about 8,000 of those men would end up at in the mountain troops at Camp Hale, and ultimately 6,000 of them would go with the division to Italy. Division at this time was about 14,000 men, so the majority of the people in the division were not these volunteers. They were in the combat units, in the infantry regiments they were, but the volunteers never made up more than about half of any unit, and sometimes even less. But what the Army discovered was that, and all this expert discovered, that if you took a fit young individual who wanted to be there and wanted to do it, they could teach them and train them to ski. And that's what they really spend February, March of 1942 up at in the Mount Rainier Park at the Paradise Lodge, figuring out how do we train large units to ski. I mean, ski instructors traditionally teach a few handfuls, right? How do you teach over 600 men to ski at the same time? It was it was an interesting and lengthy experiment. You can see that picture in the center here of one of the units going, one of the companies heading out for ski training. They also had to test equipment at this time, early 42. They didn't start getting the mountaineering equipment, the crampons, the ice axes, for example, until about April, May. And so in May of 1942, this picture here, they do in a sense of Mount Rainier. And here you see, I think it's John Woodward and Walter Prager, I believe, who are basically climbing over the Bergfront on the way up Mount Rainier. The Quartermaster General would send a test expedition of American mountaineers to Mount McKinley, now Denali, to test all sorts of equipment. That was one of the first summits of Denali by a number of these American mountaineers. It was a boondoggle, but they did test a lot of the equipment and do it quite right. Now, by the spring of 42, it was pretty clear the Pacific Northwest was not the best place to train mountain troops. The bases were too far away from the mountains. Western Defense Command, which controlled the West Coast, had first call on it. The unit's training in May of 1942 got taken out of training and sent down to the coast against a possible Japanese invasion. That was actually responding to the intelligence about what would lead to the Battle of Midway. And so they say, we have to find ourselves a mountain camp. And so they start looking for this mountain camp. And again, they've been thinking about this for over a year, and they had a couple of specifications. One, they wanted one that had a hardtop road and a railroad leading to it for obvious reasons, to bring in material, to bring in personnel, and so forth. Railroads were the primary way to move cargo in the United States in the 1940s, and they still are today. It needed to have a large enough area to build barracks and stables for about 15,000 men and 5,000 mules. So it had to be a small city, larger than any mountain town was in any locale in the United States at that time. They needed it to have regular lengthy period of snow. And so they settled upon 9,000 feet as the elevation it needed to be at, not completely understanding that that was problematic when it came to elevation issues. They wanted it to be near an urban center, a city. The Army, these were all draftees or volunteer citizen soldiers. They needed a place to get away. They needed a town where their families could live if they chose to accompany them. And so they were looking for all this. And they finally settled upon a rail stop in the Colorado Rockies. They looked in the Colorado Rockies. They looked in the up around Yellowstone. And that was it. As far as I know, they looked a little bit in southern Wyoming in the winds, and they didn't look anywhere else as far as I have been able to tell. They discovered this place called Pando, a stop outside Leadville, Colorado. It met every requirement. It had just had a new road built through it, Highway 24, the most expensive piece of highway built to that time, mainly because of the bridge near Red Cliff. Which I will likely be driving over here in a few hours on my way into the mountains for the weekend. And it had snow on the ground from October or November until at least June. We say in Colorado, summer is the shortest month. Never mind season, just month in the mountains, in the high country. So they start building this in April 42. They go into this camp, they level it out. They straighten out the Eagle River, put into a channel where it is today. They had to move like 200 beaver out of there. They reroute the railroad to the other side of the valley, just above the road, and they start building this camp, one of the most expensive camp built during World War II. And the intent they are building it for is to activate a mountain division in 1942. They're going to have an 89th, 100th division is going to be activated in December of 42. Well, let's put this new camp and call it a mountain unit. And they said, well, do you want to do basic training in the middle of a Colorado winter? And they said, no. Okay. Maybe the 89th division that's going to activate at Carson in July. Maybe we can use that. Now, we're not so sure. What happens is by the summer of 42, the United States is running into manpower shortages. It's running into shortages of everything. In fact, shipping, weapons, production, manpower, large scale mobilization is difficult. And so they decide, okay, we will hold off until 1943 of activating a division, but we're going to create a thing called a mountain training center. That's basically a proto division headquarters, and we'll give it all the units, and we'll send it up to Camp Hale, as they now are going to call the camp, named for a Colorado National Guard general in the Spanish-American War. We will move them up there when it's completed, and they will run all the tests, and they will determine how we're going to organize the whole division. Remember, we'd only ever had a battalion, 750 guys in the mountains. Let's run a test with, a few thousand before we try to do tens of 10,000 up in the mountains. So they do that. The 87th Mountain Infantry, the 1st Regiment, expands in the summer. National Ski Patrol, again, provides a lot of the volunteers for that through their offices. And then they continue to expand and activate the 86th Mountain Infantry in the fall. In December of 1942, the cowboy who trained me up in Wyoming, Walter Bales Jr., who had joined the Army a year earlier, was a quartermaster mule packer, and he got sent up to train with them for a few months until mid-1943. And he had some very interesting stories of this Wyoming cowboy interacting with all these Eastern skiers. And so what comes out of this is a good bar bet for y'all. The thing is this, is 10th Mountain Division was never at Camp Hale. So if you want to win a free beer off your friends tonight, you're welcome to use that one from me. So 1943, we're now up there. We're now into full swing. They have to issue a whole bunch of equipment. If you go in the book, I have a table, several tables of all the gear. Gearhead, backcountry skier with a history problem. I was curious what they had. And there was, like I said, 3 things that most people would never have seen. The ski cap, not an issue item of any way, shape, or form. Pullovers, short sleeve sweaters, long sleeve sweaters, a ski parka that was reversible, one side white, the other side olive drab, ski trousers with the loop under the foot to hold it down, ski mountain boots, probably the best boot the Army has ever designed on its own. All this equipment, and you can see in that middle photo there, a bunch of troopers in the spring of 42 at Hale, all kitted up with everything on their backs and ready to probably move up to do some ski training. So one of the things that happens is the Army says by February of 43, hey, you have all the guys now. You need to run a test with the whole battalion. Take them out in the field, see what they can do. So they take a battalion and they drop it off outside other side of Chicago of Tennessee Pass. If you've been there, there's a big circle as you're coming out of Leadville. There's a parking area for the Nordic area. They drop them off there and they're going to go into Homestake Peak. Well, it's a blizzard. Lows around 4 degrees, high around 4 degrees in the single digits. The men stand there, they put on all their gear, they didn't move out, and they immediately begin to sweat. They start moving up the mountains. They didn't know how to put on their skins. They don't use their skis because it turns out most of that battalion was full of fillers who had been sent from the 30 and 31st Division that had mainly been recruited from the South and had been training in the Mississippi Delta. And they knew absolutely nothing about the mountains. And so all the experienced people had been sent off to do other things. And it became a week-long survival test. They succeeded, but a third of all those men came down with some sort of exposure casualty, pointing to the challenges of it. If you've ever been to Colorado, go into the 10th Mountain Hut of the 10th Mountain Division below Homestake Peak. That's where they bivouacked, and that's where they did actually a lot of training over time there. And so one of the things they realized they had to have was they needed more experienced people. So they started taking enlisted men who had the qualification, which was about, of the volunteers, about 80% of the volunteers all had the qualifications to be officers. But if you were sent to officer candidate school, they wouldn't send you back to your unit. So none of them wanted to go to officer candidate school. They wanted to stay in the mountains. And so the 10th Camp Hale got a special deal. If you were assigned to Camp Hale, went to mountain training, went to officer candidate school, you came back to Camp Hale. And so ultimately, most of the officers, I think almost all of them, especially at the lieutenant and captain level, came from the ranks. And this made it a very, very unique unit. So the first thing they had, of course, do in winter of 43 was ski training. And of course, they do that up at Ski Cooper. They build a 1-mile-long rope tow. That it's no longer rope tow, but it's still a very slow 2-chair going up, very high, very slow, very cold. I love Ski Cooper. They won't change. They're awesome. Here you can see the skis. I put the bindings and the boots. The boots, those are ski boots. They would let her say go ski mountain boot. I'll point that out later. This was a Kandahar type binding, it was known as. It was actually what we would consider to be an all-terrain binding today, an AT binding. It had a cable. It had around the back. It had toe irons up front that could be adjusted for depending on the boot size, and it had 3 hooks. There's 1 hook on the toe iron, and you see two hooks down on the ski. You hook 1 hook in, you hook the cable into 1 hook, you have yourself a Nordic ski, cross country. You hook it into 2 hooks, you have yourself an uphill ski, and use your waxes or your climbers. These were mohair, no glue. Sorry, they were all straps. You could go uphill. They were actually really good with their waxes. way better than we are today. And then you put it into all three hooks, you had yourself a downhill binding. And if you knew how to do the telemark turn, you could do a tele turn in this. They did not teach the tele turn specifically because it remains a difficult turn then, even more so than it is today. You're talking to someone who is still working on being a telemark skier. The skiing was really basically there. It was very simple, focused on snow plows, stem turns, but they added a side slip in, which was not normally taught. And indeed, the system they developed teaching in many ways is the basis of the PSIA training that you see today. A couple of instructors went back through all of their lessons and concluded that in an article a while back. The skis were 77 millimeters, 77, they were 77 underfoot. I know that because I asked everyone who had a pair of skis to measure them for me between History Colorado Museum, thanks to them, and also the 10th, David Little at the 10th Mountain Living History Foundation. Also great folks. They were very long. 206 centimeters was the shortest ski. They went up to 228. Very long, very narrow, as we will see. The lessons, they divided their days into about 40 3-hour lessons. A third of every lesson, 1 hour, was spent on cross-country techniques. So they were not doing a lot of downhill training. This was all survival skiing, mobility skiing, less than ripping it downhill. Oh yeah, they would do that when they get the chance, but it was all about not falling, not getting hurt. The Army did put together early 41. Actually, I take it back, the Army didn't do it. Some producers in Hollywood in early 41 decided that the Army needed a ski training film. Walt Disney was a big skier. Walt tellied. I've seen video of him doing that. And there's a tape from that called The Basic Principles of Skiing. You can still find this out on the YouTubes. It's also on Amazon. You can find it on some CDs of early ski films, and it's quite fun watching. There, John Woodward would end up as a major by the end of the war, had been captain of the Oregon ski team, and was involved in a lot of the ski training. He's demonstrating the proper technique position to begin to initiate a stem turn. Weight on the outside left leg, bringing the right leg in. They did do some alpine training. Here you see specifically on ice, glacier training. Not a lot of glaciers in Colorado. One of the downsides, they built an artificial glacier up a place called Resolution Creek, and it promptly melted because they built it on a south-facing exposure. They didn't rebuilt it on a northern exposure, and you see it here where you can see anyone who's ever been out knows that is practicing self-belay rescue techniques with their ice axes. You can see the ice axes. They were pretty hefty. After the war, the mountaineers who designed them went, oh, we probably should have done that a little bit smaller and shorter had we been thinking. You also see they're wearing a different type of jacket. This is a mountain jacket. It had 4 big pockets. It had a hood. It was kind of what mountaineers liked, and it is the forerunner of the field jacket, beloved of hippies and hipsters everywhere, that the Army would start to make in 1943. They did a lot of survival training because their training areas are all up in the mountains. They required 30 nights of camping outside as part of their training cycle. 6 of those would be above tree line, and 2 of those nights would be without tents. And in fact, they got really good at winter bivouacking, digging snow holes, putting their sleeping bags in, lining them with tree boughs. In fact, the forester, the assigned to the camp from the Forest Service, kept asking them, "Can you not chop so many bows down to line your tents, line your sleeping positions?" There was some pretty good avalanche knowledge floating around. They knew this. This is a 1936 publication in the bottom right by a British author. All the ski mountaineers in the United States knew of this guy. They studied him, and they basically had this. But they didn't have a lot of problems with avalanches. 2 reasons. One, this best avalanche science at the time was avoid avalanche terrain. That, to be honest, was what they taught. So once they knew it, they avoided it. They also, most of their training areas were low angle and west facing. Vail Pass, Tennessee Pass, and areas like around Homestake Peak at the base of that mountain. The Avalanche Pass are clear once you know what you're looking for. So they managed to avoid some avalanches. They had some small accidents. Some of the instructors who were better skiers did put themselves in more hazardous terrain, but in general, they just avoided the whole thing rather than dealing with it, which was, I found, an interesting thing that I found when I started out. So spring 1943, starting to have some snow melt. Wildflowers are starting to pop out, but there's no mountain division being activated. There was some uncertainty why what was going on, and they quickly learned. The Army had decided to run another experiment. This was what they called a light division. The idea is you could get 9,000 men of combat power, 12,000 men of combat power for 9,000 men. So what was supposed to become 10th Mountain Division is activated as the 10th Light Division. Alpine, they just called themselves the 10th Division. Because they're an experimental unit, they had no patch. They had no mission. They were not training anything specific. And that would cause some problems later on. They proceeded thus into the divisional training. The Army at this time ran divisions through pretty much an assembly line of about 3 months of basic training, 3 months of unit training. That would take you out to about the battalion, again, 750 guys, and then 3 months of combined training. That would take you to the regiment and division level. Part of this unit training they started in really August of 1943 was mountain training, mountain combat training, they called it. And they set up a system to run one battalion through at a time for a week. And this is the map. And it is actually north of Camp Hale, about 5 miles, where Homestake Road, Forest Road 703 today, meets Highway 24. There's a big set of crags there. You can still see them. And that is where they went and bivouacked and trained on rock climbing for the week. The rock climb was relatively straightforward. They focused on kind of handholds and climbing techniques, a bit on knots, only like an overhand, a square knot, some bowlines, pretty straightforward, not terribly sophisticated, because they were just teaching them how to move through the terrain, not so much to be mountain climbers. They had hemp ropes. You can see them in the upper right-hand corner. There's also a picture of the ice axe. And they were also getting by this time nylon ropes. And the climbers amongst you will tell you that a nylon rope today, they're even better today, has more give to it. A hemp rope will stretch and snap. A hemp rope will stretch for a bit more before it snaps. So the hemp ropes, you can see in the middle picture there, it's a hard one to look at, but take a look at it for a while. On the bottom, you'll see a group of about 8 to 10 guys getting ready to climb. On the left, they've put all their packs into a canvas. So they've put all their packs and equipment together, and they're hauling that up with a couple of hemp ropes. And to the right, there's an olive drab rope going up that they're getting ready to, they're climbing to get up to the top. So a whole squad moving over an obstacle there. They didn't do a lot with pitons. You can see pitons and carabiners in the bottom. By the way, they called carabiner snaplinks because carabiner was a German word. So that's where it comes from. And you can see also there's actually on the far right is an ice piton as well. They also taught them a lot of basic mountain survival skills. How to pack their rucksacks. Rucksacks, again, new piece of technology for the majority of these men. Now we're talking there's 6, 7, almost 8,000 men undergoing this training. They show them how to do their rucksacks. They show them how to use their mountain stoves. You see a stove in the bottom corner here. How to use a mountain ration that was developed with lots of dehydrated foods to make them palatable so you would eat in the mountains. Altitude, in theory, suppresses appetites. I keep telling myself that as I, jam the second Snickers of the day into my mouth. I guess it's supposed to. It doesn't seem to work on me. But they taught them to use this, and they taught them to put up their mountain tents. You can see them there. They were green on this side. They were white on the other. They didn't like them a lot in winter. They did not breathe. They were going to make them out of nylon. Nylon had to be used for parachutes, so they were canvas, and they were very they generally just didn't bother. Just dug a snow hole and put their sleeping bags in it. This is probably up in Gold Park campground where that is today. You can see the mess tent probably down on the bottom of the picture as well. And they learned to survive. They got really good at moving and surviving in the mountains. And their division staff, even more so, had to learn how to do this because they continually thought they could move faster and farther than they really could. Their first field exercise was in October 25th October 1943, and they simply were going to move from Camp Hale, the North Gate, to this bivouac site you see down here in the bottom picture in Gold Park. They thought it would be about 7 miles. They gained about 2,000 foot. They thought it would take them about 6 hours. It took them 18 hours to move that far, to move about 7,000 men that far. It had snowed, the roads were slick, the mules kept falling, and mules won't get back up with a full load. They're smarter than humans. And so they kept having to stop and repack. So they started to learn, ooh, it takes a lot to work and learn in the mountains. Okay, we get into the winter of 1944 now. The winter of 43-44 was a low snow year. You didn't have a lot. It would probably, I think it's still on record here in Colorado Springs as the driest winter we've ever had. So they didn't get to start ski training until January of 44. But by this time, there's lots of ski instructors in the unit. So they're able to go out and train themselves. And it's really they do 4 weeks of training. 2 weeks are at Hale. Then they go up to Ski Cooper for 2 weeks, and they rotate the 3 regiments of the division through. This frees up all the mountain warfare instructors, all these volunteers, all the skiers and mountaineers who knew how to do this stuff, to kind of go out and have some boondoggles. They climb the 2 highest peaks here in Colorado, Mount Elbert and Mount Massive outside Leadville. They do a winter climb of those just before New Year's of 1944. Here they do the Trooper Traverse. They go from Leadville to Aspen. Here you see them climbing up behind the Champion Mill. And then there's another way over the top there. People still do this today. I think the fastest known time is somewhere around 18 hours. I think it took them 3 days to do it. 50 men moving on much slower equipment. But there's still a lot of snow around, at least 2 foot of snow on the ground by February. And in this 2 foot of snow, this division moves in to do its combined training, which involves a lot of live fire training. Machine guns, mortars, field artillery. You can see the 75 millimeter pack howitzers firing. You can see this photo. I think it's a publicity photo. I don't know where their aiming stake was for the mortar, but those mortars produce a lot of duds. And so we still find this sign you see here. I took this a couple years ago. The sign is still there. In fact, where I took it, I was just past it on Sunday. On it, that beware of duds in the mountains. A lot of these training areas still have duds in them. We haven't seen them for years, if not decades, but they're still out there somewhere. A lot of they were doing live fire attacks in 2 foot of snow on skis. That's pretty freaking amazing, in my opinion. So by April of 1944, again, they're running through this whole training cycle, right? They now have to do a division exercise. And the Army, that they call the D series, the Army did this for everybody. They said, okay, we're going to take a division, we move it to a new camp, we take another division, move it to the same camp, we have them do war games, force on force with each other. Problem, there's only one mountain camp and only one mountain trained division. And if you could send another unit up here, it would have died in these conditions. So it has to be taken out and done in-house internally. And the whole point of this division series is to train the staff. Get the staffs, get the colonels and the generals thinking about these problems, seeing can they keep people fed, can they move people around, can they replace broken items, can they evac casualties. They have to do it, but no one tells the troopers this. It just becomes another thing for them to suffer. So they do the first week. They head out, 8,000 men, 2,000 mules, 400 or so M29 Weasel over the snow vehicles, those track vehicles you still see. And they head out and they spend the first week defending Tennessee Pass against an attack. Head out right into a blizzard, into a spring blizzard. Heavy, heavy snow, strong, strong winds. It's always windy up in that part of Colorado. And they suffer. It becomes a suffer fest. You know, we have you've probably heard we talk about type 1 fun, which is fun while you're doing it, fun to remember it. Type 2 fun, it's not fun while you're doing it, but it's fun when you remember it. And there's type 3 fun. It's not fun when you're doing it, and it's not fun when you remember it. The D series was type 3 fun for these troopers. They spend the first week. They say, okay, good job. You got to stay in the field. We're pulling you out of the line, but you got to stay in the field because we got to make sure you can be fed and everything and maintained in the field. So they move them back to Hale and have them bivouac in their tents on their parade grounds within sight of their barracks. Morale kind of went down. It didn't get much better. They spend the next week doing attacks up onto Vale Pass. The snow cuts out, but it's cold. And they work their way up onto, they do 2 attacks. The last one regiment, the 86, swings around and seizes Ptarmigan Pass. So those of you who've been on Vale Pass will know where it is, and the 85th passes through on skis down and over Wingle Ridge onto Vale Pass. I would love to have seen a regimental movement on skis. And they set off an avalanche in the one piece of avalanche train off Wingle Ridge that the snow machiners set off every year. They just did it like a week and a half ago, as they always do. The 3rd week in April, it warms up. Yay, right? Their last week, they're out there. Of course, when it warms up and you're on skis, you start getting glopping to your skins, to your skis. They had it gets wet. They spend another miserable week. And at the end of this, they come out of the field. It's actually impressive in the end. That many men, that long in the field, that few exposure casualties. The trooper in this bottom picture here, I like this for 2 reasons. One, you can see the ski mountain boots. And secondly, you can see his fun meter has completely and totally pegged. His suntan has a suntan. He has absolutely nothing, no concern left to give. Well, concern is not the word I would use, but there's another word I won't say here. But you will notice he is sitting on something. I'm not sure what, but he has something under his bottom, leaning against a tree. This is an experienced backcountry skier and climber. He knows what he's going to do. Morale drops after this. They're like, why did we suffer? What were we doing? We don't have a mission. But the vision's smart. The guys, they say, hey, well, you know what? We have all the snow. Let's go ski again. So they take them out and they do spring skiing. They go back and they ski for another week. Then in June, they get a melt like, hey, let's go climbing again. And the whole division runs through another week of mountain climbing, of climbing training. Morale improves. And then they learn they're being sent to purgatory for those of us from Colorado. That's Texas. They're being sent down to Camp Swift, Texas. Again, they're not told this, it's not explained to them, but they're being sent because the Army wants them to go through more large-scale maneuvers. American divisions who had gone through series of large-scale maneuvers did very well in their first combat experience. The Army had learned. So they were trying to do more down in Louisiana. Louisiana maneuvers ran every fall, including, they were supposed to run the fall of 44, but they got canceled because all the units are being sent overseas. So 10th Mountain Division, 10th Light Division is down in Texas. What are we doing here? They did a lot of live fire training. They could do more. They had it there. But in September, they get a whole bunch of new tables of organization. And they're all saying mountain on them. They're told, hey, start reorganizing as a mountain division. Aha. What that meant is they got bigger, had more men, but what it meant for the unit level is every rifle platoon and every weapons squad got a mule and a mule pack to help them stay in supply. And the division gets bigger. They start adding more men who had never been to Hale, but they took everyone who'd been to Hale and moved them into the infantry regiments. And then began to reorganize for those into that. Because what had happened was this, is Minot Dole learns that the D series was a bad experience. He has lots of correspondence out there and they're writing. He goes and sees General Marshall and says, what are you using these guys for? Why are they here? And Marshall says, I've only got one of them. Once I send them to a theater, they're stuck there. I don't know where I need them yet. Dole says, look, you need to give them, cut them a husk here. Let's give them something special. They had a division that Patch approved in February of 44. And the troops often wore it upside down because they wanted it to be skis rather than cross bayonets. Said, let's give them a mountain tab across the top of that. Oh, good idea, Dole said. Marshall says, we'll take it under consideration. Marshall goes to his senior general and says, what are we going to do? The senior general says, let's just make them a regular infantry division. Marshall says, no. Most of these guys are volunteers, right? They signed up to be mountain troops. They've done a lot of training. They have skills that no one else has. Let's make use of it. Let's turn them into a mountain division. So throughout the fall of 1944, they are organized into a mountain division and they learn they are going somewhere. And on November 6, 1944, the division is officially reorganized as a mountain division, 6th Mountain Division with the mountain tab approved, but not issued, though men would have their own made before they departed. And they learned they were going to Italy. They were on their way. One regiment heads out in December. The rest of the division heads out in early January to Italy. So they get into Italy. They move into the Dardano River Valley into the line in February. They still stay in the line from February until the end of the war. They're the only division never to rotate out of the line, out of in a combat zone. They are in combat from the first day they enter to the last day, and they're the only division that will do that in the war. And for that, they take ultimately 1,000 killed, which is one of the larger percentages, but that's because they were in combat the whole time. They immediately begin to patrol. I think the Dardano Valley was quite familiar because it's basically you take the Camp Hale Valley and you swap it north to south, and that's what that valley looks like. You have on your left a high ridge. You have up in front of you, you have a bunch of mountains, and it must have been a semi-familiar environment for them. But they arrive with none of their mountain gear. The Army didn't send it with them. All the gear, all the equipment procured at such work and such price and such effort, they don't have, because it had been sent to Italy and no one knew what to do with it. The guys getting it didn't know what it was. They threw it in a warehouse. It's somewhere outside of Naples, and it took several months for them to start finding it. But they get some. They get some. They managed to get their hands on some skis, and they begin to do ski patrols. And they especially begin to ski patrol up on this thing that we call Riva Ridge, which really runs a series of mountains that runs 5,000 foot in the south down to about 2,000 foot. It then crosses over to Mount Belvedere and then Mount della Torrazio. And they proceed to basically take control of this area through their patrolling. If they'd had more stuff, they could have done more. And they run about 300 patrols in less than 30 days. As they get their gear, they start getting some parkas, they start getting some whites for camouflage, they start getting some crampons, they start getting pitons and climbing gear and ropes. They get a mission, and they are told, we need you to clear out German observation from the main route, and that is the road you see in that middle picture, the main highway that runs through the northern Apennine Mountains, because that's going to become, in theory, the locale of the main attack to break the Gothic line in the spring. So we need 10th Mountain Division to go and clear this out. And to do it, they have to go and take this one piece of ridge, Riva Ridge, because Riva Ridge can shoot into the backs of anyone attacking Mount Belvedere and della Torrazio. The problem with Riva Ridge is that on the Allied side, it's very straight like this, right? On the German side, it's very low angle. So on at least 3 or maybe 4 occasions, Allied troops had gotten to the top of the ridge, but could not stay in supply. And so the German troops would counterattack and force them off. So they take 1 battalion, reinforce, and say, figure out how to get up there. And they find ultimately 6 routes. 1 route going to every piece of high ground along the ridge. If you want to see a profile of that, Google 10th Mountain Distillery. That's in the Vail Valley, and that's their logo. By the way, it's good whiskey too. So just saying. They decide to do it. They pull this battalion out of the line. They send them back to a rock quarry to practice rock climbing again. They send climbing teams up prior to put ropes in, bang the pitons in with cloth covered hammers. And they set off on the 19th, 18th February and proceed to climb and are on top of this peak by the time daylight comes. And that's the right-hand picture. I think that's the farthest southern position. So every little pimple you see going north, there's an American mountain infantry company on top of it. You can see them there. They spend a week up there. They fight off repeated counterattacks. They take casualties. They take no exposure casualties, but they know how to keep them in supply. They have mules. They don't have any American mules yet. They're still on the boat on their way over, but there's Italian mules that they have, an Italian mule company. So the American mule packers go down and help out the Italian mule packers. They don't speak Italian or English, but they speak mule, and they're able to get them up onto it. They build a tramway, that's the bottom left-hand corner, up onto it. What had been an 8-hour trip now turns into 45 minutes. And they keep these guys up on that ridge for the whole time for about a week after the operation. But the whole point of taking Riva Ridge was to launch the other attacks, and those go off on the night of 19 February, and they clear out and they attack across Monte Belvedere. They get across della Torrazio, They pause for a few days and reconstitute, and then make one more push and are stopped. Not because they're not being Germans, they are. They stop them because the Germans are starting to go, uh-oh, and pull in reinforcements. And Truscott, who's the Fifth Army commander at this time, he's been told, don't make your main push in the mountains. He's going to make his main push in the mountains. He knows he's got what he needs. So he doesn't want to bring more German troops in this area. So he pulls them to a halt in 5 March 1945. And here they show themselves as amazingly good mountain troopers. They had no fear of the terrain. They knew how to work. Ridges meant nothing to them. Steep stuff, they got it. They knew how to maneuver. They knew how to get up it. They knew how to evacuate their casualties from it. They knew their battalion aid stations had to be much closer to the front line than doctrine said. They knew how to keep things in supply, how to put everything into 50-pound loads and move it on a truck, and then on a Jeep, and then on a mule, and then on the back of a man to get supplies forward. They knew how to do this because they had been doing it. They knew you attacked down ridges. You stayed out of the draws. Those are the worst place to be. They from March, 5th of March to 14 April 1941, again, they stay in the line, they rotate units, they add back in replacements. This is where future Senator Dole joins the division. He knew nothing of it being from Kansas. He just always said he just kept his mouth shut and did what his NCOs told him. And on the 14th of April, the last attack begins. They have to cross through this area, the Rufino Massif, that's the lower right-hand picture. They hit across it, 2 regiments. The Germans are pretty well dug in. They get caught, get pinned down. But on the right-hand side of this picture, 1 battalion is able to, it doesn't get caught and slips up on that ridge and climbs up, proceeds to start firing down the Germans, unhook. They clear the Massif. They get on the ridges. The entire 1st Armored Division passes behind them. They get on this ridge. 1st Armored Division on their left, 88th Infantry on their right. And they, as we said in the Marine Corps, they light their hair on fire and they attack down this ridge for basically a week. And they get into the Pearl River Valley. They are the first ones on Pearl River Valley. They break the Gothic line. The Germans would later say this is what broke it. This was their main enemy. This ended up being their hardest fight. They were surprised by the amount of combat power the Americans were able to generate in the mountains in this very rough terrain. American units hadn't been too good at that during the war. This division knew how to do it. Of course, they then go across the Po River Valley. They're pursuing up into the Alps when the war ends. They are sent over to the Italian-Yugoslav border. There's concerns about fighting breaking out there as the Yugoslavians have unredeemed land claims. There they do what they did. They went skiing. They go up onto They go up onto Mount Mangart and have a ski race. My friend Chris Anthony, Colorado Ski Hall of Famer, has done a film called Mission Mount Mangart on this. I think he was up in your neck of the woods about a month ago showing it. If you ever get a chance to see Mission Mount Mangart, I would encourage it. He uses it as a fundraiser for his foundation that takes Colorado kids skiing. 5th graders have a free ski pass, but we've got to get them transport and ski rentals and clothing and everything and lunch. So he runs this foundation, and that's what the movie is for, is to raise funds for that. They also go up onto Grossglockner Glacier in Austria, and they do glacier climbing and glacier travel, and they ski some more. I understand Chris is also doing a movie on that. So hopefully we'll see a mission Grossglockner. But the war's not over, right? Japan's still fighting. The division is loaded up in July and sent back to basically organize to be even larger and have more weapons. You needed more guys with demolitions and more supporting weapons to fight the Japanese that had been discovered. They're going to be sent to Camp Carson in Colorado, so they would have continued their mountain training unquestionably. But they learn that the war ends on their way over, and they're instead sent to Carson for discharge. And they bring themselves, they basically spend that time going through. And here it was supposed to be over, right? It wasn't. Mountain training continued by veterans of this very division throughout the 1950s. It took place, started in 46. It went through several different variants there. The one in 1951 to bring in the beloved Ram's Head. Lots of training continued. Jim Whitaker and his brother Louis were here at Camp Carson up at Hale doing mountain warfare instructors in 53 and 54. Jim Whitaker, first American on Everest, first president of REI, and one of their students was Lieutenant James Earl Jones, who remembered his time well. But in 57, with pushes, the Army took their mountain training down. But they would look back at it in the 60s. And they would look at this, and I show all these pictures here. By the time they come back around 1970, things had changed greatly. And it took them a while to bring things back up to speed. 10th Mountain Division is reactivated in the 80s, but it's not a mountain division. It is reactivated that was purely in name. It is the Vermont National Guard that brings back Army mountain units
Wow.
and the beloved Ram's Head at this time. Mountain warfare doctrine and mountain climbing would continue. Again, you would see pretty good doctrine put up. They would reach out back to mountaineers, especially due to the Afghanistan experience, the Peck River Valley. The Army now has that bottom left-hand corner, these high altitude mountaineering kits, ropes and carabiners and slings and so forth. The Marine Corps has gone out and purchased new skis. They're made by Atlantic Skis up here in Denver. But finally, there is an attempt to get back to the mountains. The 10th Mountain Division today is trying to work to get back to its roots. There you see 2 years ago, the current divisional commander and command sergeant major up on Reaver Ridge. And in the lower right, you see a bunch of their troopers back out at Camp Hale, working with National Ski Patrol. And even today, the 1st Battalion of the 157th Colorado National Guard goes into these mountains to train every winter. And they recruit ski patrollers and ice climbers and EMTs and rock climbers into their units.
So Lance, we had a question from Shin Freeman, who wanted to know if you'd ever served in the 10th Division. Obviously,
no,
World War II, but
my background is Marine Corps infantry. I was on active duty in the 90s. I actually was in a company that was trained to do cliff assaults. Then did reserve time, but no, my time has all been Marine Corps.
Yeah. Well, you would have enjoyed it though, sort of. I mean, as much as anybody did. Wow, what an amazing story. Um, I I don't envy those men. I think I read somewhere that they were not even sleeping in their tents anymore because there was something about sleeping in the tent that called attention to them, and they wound up having to sleep on the ground. I'm like, oh, yikes. Anyway, all right. Well, thank you very much, and that was wonderful. And this will be the recording will be available. It'll be on our YouTube channel. It'll also be on BCTV for those of you who are local and want to watch it there. And until then, until next time, stay warm, and we look forward to seeing everyone again. Thank you.